Who had grandparents fight in WW2 and what stories did they share? None at all. My grandpa went to Europe as a teenager and it must have been messed up because he never talked about his experience all the way up to his death. He came back with 3 medals and nobody in the family knows what he did to get them. Grandfather was a US sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a PPY officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them they were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, "If there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, take 1 step forward." Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. My paternal grandfather landed on Omaha on D-Day. That's it. That's all he ever shared. We know he spent the duration of the war in Europe, but whatever he saw or did was too much to ever tell my grandmother, dad, aunt or uncle. Both my grandfathers served in the US Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German AA gun 1 mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My granddad was in WW2 in a tank destroyer unit. He never talked about it, but when I got back from a trip to Paris in high school he asked if it was still all blowed up over there and said the last time he was there it was a big old mess. My grandpa on my dad's side was 17 at the time and lied about his age to get into the Navy. He played saxophone in the Navy band aboard ships in the Pacific. I don't think he ever saw action, though, aside from that 6-axe action of course. My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children, or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories he'd reply, "I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another," would turn his hearing aid off and nap in his chair. My Austrian grandfather was drafted into the Wehrmacht and his unit was integrated into the SS in 1944. He was wounded in January 45 in the Battle of the Bulge whilst carrying out an attack on a Rus position. He got patched up by the Americans whilst the German officer wrote a letter home that he was missing in action. He still has the original letter. He was a prisoner of war in France from then on and had to stay until 46 or 47 as he was captured as a member of the SS and they were held longer than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. He still holds a grudge against the Nazis for stealing his youth and still has some Czech or bullet fragments in his chest as far as I know. Cheers to the Americans for saving him. Grandfather was in an amphibious division in the Pacific Theater. He left us with little snippets of his time. A camp was pitch black because they didn't want to be visible from above. A guy in his cabin went to the outhouse and sat down to do his business when he heard something. He pulled his lighter out and lit it. A python was dangling down staring him in the face. He and another man were walking on a beach and the other guy just got shot through the head from a sniper. That sniper's decision led to my existence. General MacArthur showed up and gave him a promotion along with a few others. They took a video of MacArthur shaking the hands of a line of soldiers and used it for a pro-American propaganda film to be played before movies in the US. My grandma saw it and freaked the F out, and the theater owners gave her a copy of the photo. Both granddads in the Navy. Great aunt survived a concentration camp. No one says anything, ever. WW2 was like Fight Club, apparently. My grandpa was in the army. He never spoke about his service, but he was shot in the ankle and captured. He spent years in a VA hospital once he returned to the States. I heard second-hand stories about the POW camp, specifically how the guards would smoke cigarettes and then intentionally flick the butts just out of reach of the prisoners inside the fence. He and his buddies devised a tool to reach out through the fence and grab the butts when the guard turned their back. They'd then pass the butt between them to get a tiny puff. He was a very kind, very quiet, very intelligent man who had a very bad drinking problem. Edited. Thanks for all the responses and awards. This story was told to me as a child by my grandfather who spoke more Italian than English. Some details are a bit fuzzy here or there, but it's my favorite, and one I remember fondly. My grandfather, like a lot of Italians, was conscripted by the Browncoats to fight for Mussolini in the Italian army. He was sent to fight in the African campaign. Toward the beginning of the campaign he was struck by lightning and pronounced dead while on a long march during the monsoon season. At the time they were on march to a port or city. The story was a bit hazy here, alongside a column of tanks and artillery. When he was struck he was not examined immediately, just presumed dead and thrown onto a truck carrying casualties. It wasn't until about a day later, when they reached their destination, that he was properly inspected. He had been laid out with other dead when one of the men assigned to prepare the dead for burial noticed him twitching. A doctor was called over, and he was found to be alive, and sent to be evacuated and treated along with other wounded. Before he could be evacuated, someone high in the command changed his orders. Thinking he was a good luck charm, they ordered him to stay with the honor guard for the rest of the war. In reality it ended up being his own good luck charm, as he avoided seeing major combat the rest of the war. When we were kids he used to get a kick out of showing the wound to us. When the lightning struck him it hit him in the head and exited from his calf, leaving a hole in his leg. The skin had grown over it, so you wouldn't know anything was off, except maybe a scar. But where the lightning bolt exited he could put a finger in his leg down to the knuckle. We all used to ask him to show us, and we'd react like it was the grossest and coolest thing every time. I loved him. He was a great man, who after the war made his way to America to ensure we had every opportunity in life. TLDR, my grandfather was struck by lightning in the war and thought dead, only for them to realize he was alive days later. He rode out the rest of the war as a good luck charm for the command and made it home to his family to later bring them to America. When my grandmother died, we helped my grandfather move out of his house into an apartment. I had found a mason jar filled with old shiny rocks in his basement. When we looked closer, we realized it was gold teeth, AK kills from the war. That's when I learned my grandfather was a sniper. He served on the Pacific side fighting the Japanese. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 99. Well into his 90s though, he could still shoot a squirrel with a gun and a slingshot from a pretty long distance. He met up with the men in his unit every year after the war, until they all died. My grandfather was a trained medic, not frontline, but where they took immediate survivors. The Germans were known, so sabotaged train bridges, and it was standard protocol to stop and inspect them before crossing. Well, his conductor was drunk, and not only didn't stop, but was speeding into the bridge when it exploded. My aunt has the pictures, but let's just say the rubble he was found under. Wooden trains don't just derail, they shatter, especially off a bridge, was crazy. He described it to me, and I wanted to cry. He lost many friends. Grandfather trained in Canada with British officers before flying to Britain. Went to Italy, was almost killed when his jeep drove off a cliff to avoid capture by Nazis. Was taken back to Britain to heal. Looked up the family of an officer he knew. Officer's sister became my grandmother. I think grandpa saw some crap because he never talked about it, and we later found out that he was lying when he said he never saw action. My grandpa was in the Navy and was a rear gunner on a plane. He was still training when the war was finishing up, but the story goes that he was trying to shoot a target on the ground for training. He was adamant on hitting it, so he unbuckled himself to get a better shot. Because of this he got pulled out of the plane and was hanging on only by the rear gun. Eventually he was able to pull himself back into the plane surprisingly. He probably never tried that again. My great-grandfather didn't fight in WW2 per se, but he did achieve something pretty significant. He lived in Serbia, and at the end of World War II, and at liberation of Belgrade in 1944, during their retreat, the Nazis had mined every bridge they retreated past in order to stop the progress of the Soviet Red Army and the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia that were chasing them. They would have got away with it if there was not for my great-grandfather, Miladin Zeri, who had considerable experience in demining gained previously during Balkan Wars and First World War. He had seen the Nazis placing the explosives, and during the night, he saved the bridge from demolition. by climbing the bridge and single-handedly cutting all the detonator wires, making it the only large bridge in Europe, beside Ludendorff Bridge, that the Germans didn't succeed in demolishing while retreating. The importance of his act is even bigger considering that the next bridge connecting Belgrade and Sirmia was in Sabak, 90 kilometers away. He was given a medal for it, which I still have in my room, and a memorial of him was erected in Belgrade. Edit. For those who don't believe me, the only evidence I have found so far, I'm asking my mum for more, is a street sign he took when he left Belgrade. This article says he lived on Karageorgieva Street. Here is the street sign in my house he gave to my mother, which is Cyrillic for Karageorgieva. That's it for now. Thank you for watching the video. Leave your comments below. See you soon.